Good morning, and welcome to Lesson 5 in our study of the book of Romans. In the first part of this book, Paul introduces himself to the people to whom he's speaking. He introduces himself as to who he is. He says that he's a servant of Christ, and that he is writing to the people of the church, to the saints in the church in Rome. This is the first part of this first chapter. And then he gives an introduction as to what needs to be done, because he says he's not ashamed of the gospel of God, and that everyone who believes really must live by faith. The just must live by faith. This whole premise, is that he is not ashamed and that the just must live by faith. And this was written at a time when Nero was emperor and paganism and all sorts of devilish practices were taking place without Rome. In fact, it is said that Nero himself used to take Christians and douse them with pitch and use them as living torches in his garden. This is the type of society to which Paul was writing, but he was writing in a way which showed that he had no fear of what he was saying, that he was not ashamed of what he was saying. And we get into this next verse, verse 18. And he starts off by being very blunt. He says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who suppress the truth in unrighteousness." Now, we today don't hear much about the wrath of God. We hear a lot about God's grace and God's compassion and God's mercy and God's love. We hear about these attributes, but we don't hear much about the wrath of God, although the Bible actually tells us more and speaks more about God's wrath than it does about God's love. And this is a wrath which is really meant a hatred of sin, a dislike of man's actions, a disagreement with what man is doing, than actual overt anger, or what we consider as wrath today. But it talks about God's wrath being revealed from heaven. In the previous few verses we talked about faith to faith being given, where someone receives faith and then they transmit that faith or give that faith as well to someone else. So that righteousness is given from faith to faith. But God's wrath and judgment is revealed from heaven. It's not our duty to do that. This is what comes directly from God himself. Against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. Ungodliness is considered to be that which is given acts against God himself. Now we all do this. They may be minor, what we consider minor acts, or major acts, but they're all acts against God. And it says against all ungodliness and unrighteousness. Unrighteousness means the acts of men against men. Now this really encompasses the commandments, because the first commandments in the Bible, back in Exodus, were talked about acts against God. And the last commandments were talked about acts from man against man. So this is what he's saying, against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Because we're unrighteous, because we are against each other, we don't really understand the truth. Now it says that in Acts 20, Paul was saying, "For I have not shunned to declare to you the whole counsel of God." And it says in Ecclesiastes, Solomon was saying, "Fear God and keep his commandments." So we have these instructions in the book, what we are to do. We are to keep God's commandments and his instructions. And the fact that this has been made known to us, gives us the reason for this verse. "Against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who suppress the truth in unrighteousness." Because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. In other words, what it's saying, what we know about God, what we need to know about God. We don't know everything about him. We never will. He is a supreme spirit being far above our level. We won't know everything about him, but we do know certain things about him. And the two things we do know are his power and Godhead. And this is given to us in many ways. One, through our conscience. And we know inherently in ourselves what we should do and what we should not do. This is what it says, for the knowledge, for what may be known of God is manifest in them. It's manifest through our conscience. And this applies even to people who have never heard the gospel, even to people who have never even heard about God himself. It talks about the shipwreck of Paul on the island of Malta in Acts, where the people there welcomed them and helped them and brought them back, nourished them back to health. And when he was bitten by a viper, the natives felt this was a punishment because of sin. So they knew, even though they were not aware of God per se, and they were not aware of Christ, they were aware of the need for sin to be punished. And the idea of God was well known even before before the Gospels were given, or even before the name of Jehovah was known outside of Israel. For instance, it says that Cicero, many years before the birth of Christ, wrote this: nature herself has imprinted on the minds of all the idea of a God. Ovid wrote, there is a God within us and we glow when he stirs us. Seneca wrote, call it nature, fate, fortune, all are but names of the one and same God. Tacitus wrote, God is the ruler of all. So these are non-Christian writers who knew themselves that God revealed it to them. God revealed himself to them in a way through their conscience and through what they thought and their deeds. And it says also that what is clearly seen, God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. We should know that there is a God because of the creation around us. Everything that's created has a creator. But the problem is that we have taken the creation and have worshipped the creation rather than God himself, the creator. And this is what he's saying. We have no excuse because God has revealed it in us through our conscience and to us through what we can see in this natural and environmental world around us. God has shown us his Godhead, the fact that he is supreme, there is a supreme deity, he is God, and that there shows his power in what he can do. Now, there are people who have never heard of God, who have never heard of Christ, who still know within their hearts that there is a God and that there is evidence of God's power through nature. Every society that's ever been found on earth has always had some concept of a divinity which is supreme over mankind. Their ideas may be wrong, their ideas may be out of sync with what is reality, but they have an idea in their hearts. They know in their being that there is a God. They know in their being that the God is powerful. In fact, in those societies, you don't really find atheists. You don't really find people who do not believe in God as you do in Western society. These people are universally knowledgeable because of what has been revealed to them, that there is a God. They may not understand the fullness and the correct terms for God, but they know that there is a divine being, and they know that he is powerful and needs to be worshipped. And this is what he's saying, because in his invisible attributes, from the creation of the world, his power and Godhead have been clearly seen. And being understood, should be understood through the things that are created, through the things that are made, his eternal power and Godhead, so that people are without excuse in saying that there is no God, or denying God. That we have knowledge of Christ, and we have knowledge of how God really functions. We have his word. But we still do not accept that. We do not accept that, says, because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were they thankful. They did not say that they did not recognize God. They decided to make different changes. People did not like what God had said, and they thought they could change things to satisfy their own way of feeling. What they have done, what we have done, is often created a God in our image, rather than becoming a person in God's image. So we did not glorify God. We were not worship God. We did not recognize what he had done. People then did not as well. And don't forget, Paul now is speaking to the saints in Rome, to the Christians in Rome, not necessarily to all the pagans, but to the Christians in Rome. He was saying people did not glorify him as God, nor were they thankful. We don't give thanks enough for what we have. We don't give thanks for what we see every day, for what we hear every day, what we experience every day. We don't give thanks for our food, for our air, for the air that we have, for the sunshine, for the rain, for what is there to replenish and maintain the earth. We abuse it. We do things that we should not do with it. We aren't thankful for what we have. And we try to feel that we don't have to thank God because we can handle things ourselves. And it's obvious from what is going on around us that we can't. We became futile in our thoughts. We became futile in our vanities. Our vanity makes us think that we can do things our way without God, and that as a result, we don't need to give thanks to God, or don't really have to acknowledge him as God himself. See, we don't take advantage, we don't really think about what we can see and the things that we can't see. We know that the universe is immense, far more immense than was thought even 20 years ago. And even Kepler said, the undevout astronomer is mad. He recognized that there was a God behind this, but we now try to think that we don't need God because we can explain it all ourselves. We can explain, perhaps, just to a great extent, what God has done, but it doesn't say that it could have been done without God. In the same vein, there's a huge amount of knowledge being determined about the atom and subatomic particles. We know a lot about how they work, how they function, the basis of atomic energy, the basis of the atom. But we still often don't know how these particles function entirely. And in fact, in many cases do not even see the particles that we're studying, although we know they're there by the function and by the traces that they leave. In the same way, it certainly says, no one has ever seen God at any time, but because of what we see around us, because of the evidence of what has been done, we should recognize that there is a God. God is light. it is light. We can't necessarily always see light, but in him there's no darkness at all, 1 John 1:5. But we ourselves continually try to deny the fact that God exists, that there is a supreme deity behind everything that is in our world. It says in Jeremiah that the heart is deceitful above all things and totally wicked, desperately wicked. So this is what has happened. We know that we can see through the experience of around us and through our consciences that God has revealed to us and has shown us his Godhead and his power. But we have tried to take unrighteousness, we have tried to take our way of thinking and have denied the truth. And because, even though we know in our hearts there must be a deity behind this, we try to deny it. We don't worship him, we don't glorify him as God, we don't thank him for what we have. We became vain. We become self-empowered so that we think we can do things ourselves much more than we really can. We became futile in our thoughts and in our vanity, and foolish hearts were darkened. We continually deny and try to work around the existence of God. Professing to be wise, they became fools. People have developed philosophies about the world and about how it has developed and about how it has come into existence, about how things interact. We developed all sorts of programs about self-help, about self-indulgences, about how to live in this world. But all of it has to do without God. We have become wise, but we have actually become foolish in our actions. Professing to be wise, they became fools. So what have we done? We've done the same thing that they've done in past times. We have taken the knowledge that we need to have a God. We know in our hearts there's something, so we've taken other things and have made them into our gods. And people have made gods, which is totally incorruptible, but into an image which is corruptible. We've made images and worshipped them. There's a story in Judges about Micah, who took this material, this god, this silver, and made it into an idol for himself and worshipped it. And when the opposing forces came through and raided his home, they took the god that he had made with them. And he went chasing after them to rescue his god. Now, if you think of it, that's kind of foolish. If God is that powerless that he can't do anything to help himself, then he's not much really, should not be worthy of worship. There's another story about a woodcutter who took a tree and cut it down, fastened part of it into a god which he worshipped, and the rest he burnt as fuel. I mean, this is kind of silly, but this is what we do. We take objects which are ordinary, which we ourselves have made, and worship them as the God of the universe, rather than worshiping the true God who has made everything, who has made the material that we make into gods. And this is we've done even worse. We've changed the glory of God into an image of a like corruptible man, and then into birds and four-footed animals and creeping things. And if you look at some of these societies throughout the world, societies of the Middle East, the ancient society of Egypt, where they had all sorts of gods made of animals and of strange beings and of reptiles and of snakes and of crocodiles, and worshipped them as being gods of the universe. This is what we have done. We've taken the God that God has himself has exposed to us through our conscience and through his creation, and we have, through unrighteousness, suppressed the truth. We've taken it to the point we no longer worship God, glorify God, thank God, but we take all other things and have made them into the gods that we now worship. And today, some of those gods are money, our power, our prestige, our wealth, work. You can name a lot of things which we actually spend more time into thinking about, studying, worshipping than we do about God himself. So what we have taken and changed the incorruptible God into all sorts of corruptible items and beings and images. And this is ungodly. This is against godliness, because we're not supposed to make anything in the image of or to worship something rather than God himself. God said in the first commandment, I will have no other gods before me. And this is what we have done. We have taken all of the subjects, all of the creation, and tend to worship creation rather than the God who made the created things. So this is the subject of this. This is the first part of Paul's admonishment to the Church of Rome. This is the fall of man. This is how man has fallen from the heights to which he should be. And for the next 2 or 3 chapters of the book of Romans, we're going to hear some of these ways in which mankind has fallen. It does get better after that, but the first few chapters are somewhat require some soul searching, because they are objects and ideas about which we often don't hear anymore. And it's against these types of activities, against this type of living, which brings forth the wrath of God. And like I said, there is more in the Bible about the wrath of God than there is about the love of God. There's more in the Bible about sin than there is about the love of God. Wrath of God and sin are 2 things which we don't often hear very much about these days. So this sort of introduces this part of the book to us. This is what Paul is referring to when he says the wrath of God against ungodliness, unrighteousness, and against unthankfulness, and against the idea of idolatry. So we'll get on further into this chapter next week. Thanks for watching. I hope you'll join me for that next lesson. Bye for now.